It's great to be here, and especially my involvement in women in science in South Africa actually started in 1994 when the ANC came into power, and they started something called the National Science and Technology Forum. And a friend and I looked at this and we thought, this is going to be a body that advises the new government on science. They need the women's voices. So we said, let's start something. So we started something called SAY, South African Women in Science and Engineering. And it started because I was professor of microbiology there at the time. It started at the University of Cape Town. It has since spread to a number of different universities, but it's still really university-based, and it's very much to help academics get ahead, and we do a lot of work with schoolgirls to bring them in and meet women scientists and that sort of thing. But this organization, the Organization of Women in Science in the Developing World, that started a South African chapter as long ago as about 2009. But I was only peripherally involved, and it sort of drifted for a while. And then I was asked if I would come onto the committee of the organization, and I went to our first meeting last year, and it just blew me away. And I just want to share with you how fantastic this group is and what wonderful work we now are doing. And it's quite interesting because the organization, I'm the only white woman in the organization, but because I'm retired, I'm the chair, because I've got time to spare stuff. So let's get on with the show. Let's do that. Okay, so the parent organization is based in Trieste, Italy. It has funding from a number of different countries, but it comes under the auspices of the TWAS. Now, TWAS used to stand for the Third World Academy of Science, but people didn't like that, so it's now called the World Academy of Science. But it is really in the developing world. So it's the OWSD International, or OWSD International, all these acronyms with their pronunciations, yeah. It aims to promote women's access to science, technology, and innovation, and particularly to involve decision makers. And I'm going to talk to you a lot about the policy, because really we've got to change the policies before we can change what's really happening to women in these fields. So it's the decision-making processes for development of their countries. The other thing it hosts is something quite new called GenderInSITE, and that's gender in science, innovation, technology, and engineering. It's just a slightly different arm, but it all comes under OWSD, and they have different funding. So, it's sort of like you just go with the flow. And whoever's giving the money and who's ever doing something that's interesting, you go for it. And that's also to raise awareness in decision makers on gender in site, and it's aimed at both men and women. This is terribly important, and I'll come back to it. It's terribly important to have the men on the side of the women as well. And it focuses here in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa. Now, how did OWSD Republic of South Africa come about? And this is quite significant. It's based in Pretoria. It's hosted by the South African Academy of Sciences, ASAF. So, lots of countries have academies of science. You've got the National Science Foundation. All the academies, I'll tell you a funny story about the start of the South African Academy, which started a long time ago. It was purely political, because we had the Royal Society, which was white male to the nth degree, an offshoot of the London Royal Society. And then we had an Afrikaans Nationalist Party group, which was terribly powerful because, of course, the nationalist government at the time gave them all the money. And now they wanted something independent and neutral that could talk to the other countries, you see. So they said, let's start an academy. So actually one of my former colleagues became the president. And then they were looking for two vice presidents. And it still is, the Academy of Science is not just natural sciences. It's the social sciences and all the sciences. And that's quite important because of in my field, genetically modified crops, if we don't have the social sciences on our sides, we're in a hiding to nowhere. Anyway, so the one vice chancellor was a poet, the one vice president was a poet, and then they were looking for a woman. And at the time, the vice chancellor at my university was a woman, black woman. And so they wanted her. She said, no, I'm too busy. Jennifer will do it. So I became the vice president just because it was politically important to have a woman there. Anyway, so it started as a very political organization. Now it is doing fantastic. Can I just tell you something it's just done? It's just brought out a study on homosexuality in Africa. Whoa. And we did it jointly with Ugandan Academy. And Uganda has the death sentence for homosexuals. Fortunately, the president of the academy in Uganda is a friend of the President Museveni. You're not from Uganda, are you? Okay. And so he sort of is immune. But and what it turns out was that homosexuality was widespread in Africa until the colonial era. And then the colonial people came with all their religion and stuff and said, we can't have homosexuality. And that's been sort of perpetuated. But Africans don't realize that if you go back a few generations, it was fine. So that's another fight, but I'm not fighting that fight. I've got enough on my plate. Okay, so... And what's interesting is we hear from Trieste that actually the South African OWSD office is just about the best that they've got. For instance, in Nigeria, they've got about 10. They just pop up all over the show. And what's important about ours is we're hosted by an academy. So we've got an infrastructure, we've got personnel, they help fund it, and so it's just got a structure. We've got secretariat and all that sort of stuff. What is interesting, and this is, I'm going to come back to it, OWSD has a fellowship program. So in Africa, they've got a fellowship program to send young women, masters and PhD students, to different universities. And South Africa hosts 30 of these. We're the biggest country actually worldwide that hosts OWSD fellows. And we've got 10 at my university, so I'm getting to know those 10, and it's really fascinating to hear what they... I've got 2 from Sudan who, you can imagine, they're in IT, and they, you know, to come from Sudan and to persuade their male colleagues or their male family members that they can come to Cape Town and become PhD students, you know, it's quite interesting to see what they have to overcome in their home countries. So, and recently we had a conference that I'm going to talk about just now. So one of the things we do as OWSD, we run mentoring programs. So for instance, I'm a mentor of these students at the University of Cape Town, and we've got one at every university so that they are mentored and they've got people to run to if they've got a problem, and people to brag to if they're doing well. And we do workshops also on how to publicize. Very big on communication. The whole emphasis of OWSD is how to talk to other people about the importance of being a woman in science. Community involvement, big issue. Then recently, there's something that started up in South Africa. It's an internet information daily blog that comes out, only written by academics on different topics, science, education, policy, all sorts of things. And so in South Africa, August is Women's Month. And so in August, we got hold of the conversation, and we had 5 articles, one every week and one plus. So people were writing, I wrote on what OWSD was about. We had a young woman scientist talking about her problems. We had a senior scientist who's now a deputy vice chancellor saying what it was like coming up through the ranks and all sorts of things like that. And then we had a woman who's very involved in mentoring, and she talked about the mentoring issues. So, and then what we're planning to do now is that every Father's Day and Mother's Day, we want to have campaigns on communication about, and we want to have, you know, that we have bring a girl to work. We want those sorts of things, but we want fathers to take their girls to work. You know, involve the fathers as much as the mothers. Right. So, so the big thing is science policy. to influence science policy. One of the things that we've done, we were chosen, our South African one, to look at academies of science across the world. Shows how important we are as a chapter. And disaggregate the data, look at the men and the women separately, and look at the roles that men and women are playing in academies around the world. And really interesting one that we're still in the process of doing it. Very difficult to get this sort of information from African academies. We really almost have to have a person we know to say, actually, can you go and force their hands? Because they don't want to tell you this sort of stuff because they look so bad. The Royal Society, like Royal Society of the UK, I mean, quintessentially white male, okay? Their women percentages maybe 12, 15%. Look at the office bearers. Look at the people who do the work. Mostly women. Typical. Typical. You know, if you want the work done, get a woman. Sorry. So now we need a gender lens on everything that the department does, science and technology, and our host organization. I went to present our case to the board of the Academy. And I said, you people are not using us enough. You are not using us in your working groups and in all your programs. Remember that there are women in the Academy and use us. So they looked a bit embarrassed about that too. But the Department of Science, I think I've got a slide coming up, but I want to tell you about this because no, I'll talk about it later. But the Department of Science and Technology used to have a gender desk, and it sort of slipped and slid, and even though the minister is a woman, we haven't got an active gender desk. And one of the things I said to the Academy, I said, there's a recent paper, actually, I should have brought it along, I think it's in Nature, and there's also one in National Geographic, on why we need a gender lens in everything. For instance, if you're doing studies on rats, and the technician is a man, and you're looking at pain thresholds or something like that, with medication or stuff, the rats actually are scared of men. How do they know that? Because if a woman goes in, they react differently. And they aren't as nervous. If a woman goes in wearing a men's outfit that has been worn by a man, the rats are scared as if they were men. Gender lens is important. Pain thresholds. We shouldn't be using as much of certain medications as the men, but they're all studied on male rats. And because why? Because female rats have got hormones. So do we. So, duh. So we've got to force these issues, you see. So I said we must include women and then we want to co-sponsor this. I'm going to be talking about this. We now have a young Academy of Sciences, and we just had a conference on that, and the topic of that was women in science, and I'll talk about that just now because that was very interesting because the men came in hordes. And at first I thought they were just coming because they wanted to meet the women, but actually they were quite passionate about the role of women in science, these young men. Okay, so our aim is in the Department of Science and Technology to have a gender desk and to use their funding. You see, all the research funding comes ultimately from the Department of Science and Technology. We have a National Research Foundation that actually gives out the money, but the money comes from the Department of Science and Technology. So if the Department of Science and Technology says, this is the policy, you've got to do this and this and this in terms of gender equity, then the recipients have to take note. And the universities, if they want to get grants for their scientists, have to take note. And I'll talk to you about the things we want universities to do, so they can use their funding to implement gender-sensitive policies. Now, let me backtrack a little bit. Recently, and I'm talking about in the last 6 weeks, the Minister of Science and Technology announced 42 new research chairs. Now, she does this from time to time, and she might highlight astronomy or she might highlight some other field. This round, it was for women. And she was blown away by the number of good applicants she got from women, and so she eventually appointed 42 chairs. And she came to the University of Cape Town to announce these. And she tore a strip off the Vice-Chancellor's present. She said, all these women are deserving of chairs in their own right. Why don't they already have chairs at your university? What are you not doing that you're not looking at these women in their own rights? None of these are here just because they're women. They're all there because they're excellent and they happen to be women. Because I looked at women specifically. And so one of the people who got one of these chairs had written to me beforehand, knowing I was chair of OWSD, and had said, you know, in order to get ahead, and this was actually just before she was announced as a new chair. She's in cosmology. Interestingly enough, one of the other chairs is a woman in my field who I share an office with, so that was quite fun. She said, these are a list of about 8 or 10 things that we want now particularly as mothers of women with children. In order for us to get ahead, she says, here's the list. So I had the list when I spoke to the Academy and I was presenting our case to the Academy. And one of the things that I was saying to the Academy was, please support me when I go to the Minister of Science and say, you've got to have a gender desk. And they were a bit wishy-washy, I have to say. They weren't particularly enthusiastic. So I kept on saying, I've got to do it myself. I've got to do it myself. So I went to the head of the Academy and I said, you know, I'm tired of playing with underlings. I want to go to the minister. So she said, well, if you go to the minister, she'll just tell you to go to her underlings because that's the way things work. She said, unless you bump into her. Guess what? I bumped into her. I was at a meeting in Pretoria. That was actually a waste of time. And I tried to get onto an earlier flight home. I couldn't. So I get onto the 5 o'clock flight. There's Naledi Pandor sitting right 2 rows in front of me. Now, I know her very well, and I was telling Sarah, I actually taught her daughter. You know, I know her from where she used to work at UCT before she became a minister. So I went up to her and I said, Minister, we are so ecstatic about what you said to the Vice-Chancellors, how you tore a strip off them about how these women should already have chairs. But one of the new chairs, and I have drawn up a list of what other things you can do to make these chairs now flourish. Wow, she says, I'd like to see that list. So I said, well, should I send it to your underlings? Oh, I didn't quite say that, but no, she says, this is my email, this is my personal email. This was a Monday afternoon. Tuesday, I wrote the letter and I checked it with my colleague in cosmology, and we decided on 8 points. I sent it to her at 2 o'clock. I got a reply at 4 o'clock. She said, how interesting. I'm going to work on this and I'll come back to you. She hasn't come back to me yet, so I'm giving her a break. As soon as I get back from Cornell, I will contact her and say, Minister, Kui, you know, remember me? Remember these. So these are some of the points. So easy. Don't have department meetings when the kids are out of school. So have all your meetings during school hours. Require gender representation at conferences that the Department of Science and Technology has got a funding in, and on all committees that are funded by the Department of Science and Technology. During maternity leave, provide technical support. You know, I remember one of my colleagues that worked in my lab had a baby. She came back, and after 2 days, she says, I'm resigning. Everything's changed in the last 6 months I've been on maternity leave. You know, molecular biology moves so fast. I said, no, you will go and work with one of the others and you will not leave. So, but you see, if she'd had a postdoc during her maternity leave to keep up with everything, tell her what was happening, it would have been so helpful. So that's a simple thing. Childcare, that's what we need. These things cost money. But if you want women to get ahead, you've got to pay for it. Yeah, young scientists. Okay, the cutoff date is 35, huh? Women are very different. They've taken out 6 years to have kids. Their cutoff should be at least 40. Men, you can cut off at 35, sorry. But women should have a later date. I remember our vice chancellor, this very same woman, Mampile Rampele, saying to me, women should retire later. You don't have retirement ages. We have. Women should be able to retire later if they want to. They should be able to carry on. Childcare to conferences, especially international. And this is the important thing. At every institution, have a proper Many have sort of in name only gender and equity diversity committees at all institutions to monitor what's happening and inform on best practices. We have these gender committees at universities, and they do absolutely nothing. They're there because they're supposed to do it. But if the Department of Science and Technology says we're going to have a report from you to see what we're doing, that's different, because when money is involved, things change. So these are the kinds of things that I want to be instituted at the Department of Science and Technology. And I'm not just talking out of thin air. Many of these policies have been implemented, and take a note of these. Is this going to be circulated? Yeah, because these are very interesting web pages. The UK has already got an equality charter. The USA, government funding has already instituted. They knew. Australia is perhaps the most interesting, because they have said that they have implemented some of these things, and they have said this costs money, and they've said what it costs, and boy, they say it's worth it. And then this is the article I was talking about in the National Geographic that's talking about the importance of the gender lens, that highlights these differences in even rat experiments and things like that, which is why it is important to have a gender lens on the research as well as the in policy. But I'll tell you an interesting experience I've had in the last 6 years. I have served for the Canadian government on something called, these acronyms, CIFSIF, the Canadian International Food Security Research Fund. And they give funding for food security research. It can be in marketing, it could be in animal husbandry, it could be, we actually haven't had any. They obviously invited me because they thought there might be some on GM crops, but the ones that they were put forward were so bad. But we've had recombinant DNA work in animal vaccines, and very, very effective, both in South Africa and in Kenya. So it's been a research fund that has been targeted at the developing world, from South America to Asia, and it links a Canadian institution with an institution in the developing world, and it has to be a meaningful partnership. You can't just say, oh, I've got this friend, you know, he or she will just tick the box of Canada. It's got to be a real partnership. And the interesting thing is it's got a gender component. And it says, how is this going to use women in the research, and how is it going to affect women in the outcomes? And it's so interesting to read these proposals, because some of them haven't a clue. And, you know, they make all sorts of generalizations, and you can see they haven't got a clue. And some of them really take it seriously, and obviously you don't get funding unless you do take it seriously. But one of the recipients was, in the vaccine thing, was the vaccine lab in South Africa. And the leader of the group was a former PhD student in my department, not one of mine, but because I don't work in vaccines. And I said to the guy, Kevin Thomson, who was organizing this after his first visit, how is this guy coping with this? Because I don't think he actually knows that there are things called women, you know. And he said, well, he's starting to learn. And I said, a couple of years later, I said, and? He says he's a changed person. He realizes how important women are in agriculture and how important they are in the development of his technology. And he says he's just like a Damascus experience, you know, 180 degrees. So you see, if you can force these things on people. You can actually, and it's money that makes it a horrible thing. But it is. If the purse strings say you will do that, you will do that. And I think that's about all I've got to say.